The hangar smelled faintly of burnt toast and hot metal, a scent that lingered from the engineers' long hours, their failed attempts turning breakfast into ash. The hum of cooling machines filled the air, mingling with the sharp hiss of hydraulics and the distant tick of a wall clock, marking time that could not be recovered. Richard Vaughan stood near the Gulfstream G700, a monument of wealth now rendered useless. He was a man who had built empires from blueprints, yet tonight even he couldn't command this machine to live. His reflection in the polished fuselage looked older than he remembered, thinner, quieter, as if the light had dimmed behind his eyes. 6 hours, he said softly. His voice carried no anger, only fatigue. Around him, engineers exchanged uneasy glances, their sleeves stained with oil, their faces with doubt. The youngest among them adjusted his glasses and muttered something about a fuel regulator. But even he didn't believe his own theory. When the last idea dissolved into silence, a voice came from the far end of the hangar. "If you permit," it said, calm but sure, "I will fix it." Heads turned. At the doorway stood a young man, clothes worn thin, face shadowed by the fluorescent light. His hair clung to his forehead, damp from the night air. He looked more like a drifter than a technician, yet there was something deliberate in the way he stood, back straight, hands visible, eyes steady. The engineers laughed quietly, a nervous kind of mockery. One of them muttered, "He must have lost his way to the shelter." Richard didn't speak. He simply looked. He had learned that genius rarely arrived dressed for the occasion. "Who are you?" he asked. The boy hesitated. Ethan Cole." His voice trembled only once, then steadied. "You said the engine won't start after throttle up. It's not fuel. It's air pressure imbalance between compressor stages. The sound gives it away." Laughter again, but softer this time, more uncertain. Ethan's eyes drifted to the jet, as if he could hear it breathing even in silence. Richard gestured toward the machine. "You're certain?" Ethan nodded. "If you permit, sir." For a moment no one moved. Then Richard extended his hand toward the bench of tools. "Give him the gloves." Somewhere in the hangar the clock kept ticking, steady, patient, as if waiting to see which man would prove it wrong first, and in that moment of quiet permission, a life began to change. The morning after had the stillness of a confession. The hangar doors remained half open, letting in a slice of pale light that stretched across the floor and stopped at the wheels of the grounded jet. The air was cooler now, heavy with the faint smell of oil and steel, a quiet reminder of yesterday's failures. Somewhere nearby, someone was warming stale coffee, and the burnt scent carried across the room like a tired echo of effort. Ethan stood a few feet inside, awkward in posture, but steady in gaze. His borrowed gloves hung too loose around his wrists. Every few seconds, he rubbed his fingers together, as though rehearsing the feel of the tools he hadn't yet been allowed to hold. Across the room, a group of engineers murmured in half-whispered tones. Their conversation had the clipped rhythm of people trying not to care about something they secretly feared. One of them, a tall man with tired eyes named Mark Holloway, the lead systems engineer, finally stepped forward. He was polite, but his politeness carried the edge of authority. "Listen, kid," Mark said, keeping his voice low but firm. "This isn't a toy you can tinker with. This jet costs more than you'll see in a lifetime. We've got protocols." Ethan nodded. He didn't flinch, but there was a visible tightening around his eyes, a brief wince that vanished before it could become emotion. "Protocols didn't start the engine yesterday," he said softly. The words lingered longer than intended. The room felt smaller. Richard Vaughan, who had been silent until now, raised his eyes from a document he hadn't been reading. "Let him look," Richard said simply. Mark hesitated. There was a moment of hesitation that wasn't about the boy. It was about pride. Mark had built his career on certainty. To let a homeless stranger touch the engine in front of his team was to risk more than embarrassment. It was to question his competence, but Richard's voice had the quiet weight of finality. "Give him the gloves," he repeated. The tools clinked as Mark placed them down. "Fine, but if something goes wrong, it won't," Ethan interrupted, though the interruption wasn't rude. It was the tone of someone who had already listened to the machine in his mind and heard its truth. He approached the jet slowly, as though stepping into sacred ground. The metallic scent of coolant, the faint heat radiating from the engine housing, the delicate vibration of distant fans, it all seemed to guide him. He leaned close, his ear almost touching the casing, listening. The engineers watched, arms crossed, expressions unreadable. Someone whispered that the kid was bluffing, that maybe he'd seen something similar online. But Ethan ignored the voices. His breathing slowed. The world seemed to contract around the sound he was chasing. He tapped lightly on the side panel, once, twice, then paused. "There," he murmured. "That's your imbalance," Mark frowned. "You're hearing what exactly?" "Metal fatigue. Resonance?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He removed a small flashlight from the nearby cart and directed it into the engine's intake. Dust floated in the beam like slow-falling snow. The clamp on the secondary airflow valve is off by a few degrees. It's tight but not aligned. You'll get vibration cancellation that tricks the sensor. When the system runs diagnostics, it compensates, but the real error stays buried. Richard tilted his head slightly. His expression was calm but sharp, like a man who had learned to recognize truth by its lack of performance. "Show him," he said. Ethan crouched, hands moving carefully along the lower assembly. He didn't rush. Every motion had intent. His silence was not uncertainty. It was focus distilled into breath. When he finally loosened the clamp, the faint hiss of released pressure filled the space. The engineers instinctively stepped closer. "There's your crack," Ethan said quietly. The fracture line was nearly invisible, hair-thin. He adjusted the sensor wire beside it, reseating it with precision that made the gesture almost tender. Mark stared for a moment, then exhaled. "How did you—" Ethan shrugged. "Engines talk. Most people just don't listen long enough." Richard smiled faintly, but not out of amusement. It was the expression of a man remembering something he once admired, the courage to be certain without arrogance. "Start it," he said. The hangar filled with a trembling hum as the systems powered up. For a moment, the red warning light blinked like a pulse out of rhythm, then steadied to green. The jet exhaled a perfect note of combustion. No one clapped. The silence that followed wasn't disbelief. It was respect being born in real time. Mark rubbed the back of his neck, the defensive tone gone from his voice. "I don't know who you are," he said, "but that was remarkable." Ethan took off the gloves and set them carefully on the bench. "Just someone who used to fix things," he said. Richard approached him, the echo of footsteps against metal filling the void. "Not used to," he said. "You still do." Outside, the morning light had grown stronger, cutting across the hangar floor in golden bands. Dust motes drifted through it like tiny ghosts of what had been, mistakes, pride, uncertainty, all dissolving in the quiet glow of competence. Ethan didn't smile. He only nodded once, as though acknowledging a truth long overdue. For the first time in months, he felt something close to belonging, not the warmth of welcome, but the calm of being seen behind him. The clock ticked on, steady and indifferent. But this time, it wasn't counting down to failure. It was marking the beginning of something quietly extraordinary. The moment a broken genius began to earn back his name. The next morning arrived without ceremony. A low fog hung over the runway, muting the sunlight and turning the hangar into a cathedral of grey. The Gulf Stream sat at the center, cold and patient, its polished surface catching fractured reflections of light. The smell of fuel and cold coffee lingered, mingled with the faint trace of burnt toast from a forgotten plate near the tool station. It was a scent that marked both failure and persistence, a quiet war between exhaustion and duty. Ethan stood beside the jet again, this time wearing the same gloves that had once belonged to someone else. They still felt too large, but his hands had begun to remember their purpose. Across from him, Richard Vaughan watched silently, arms folded, his posture neither commanding nor relaxed, the stance of a man who expected precision even from miracles. Mark Holloway, the lead engineer, arrived late, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed one to Richard and muttered, "The press already knows the jet's grounded. We'll need to be airborne by noon, or the board will make noise." Richard nodded but didn't look away from Ethan. "Then we'll be airborne by noon. Mark hesitated before lowering his voice. "You're really trusting him? A kid who walked in off the street." Richard's answer was simple. "I trust results." The hangar doors opened wider, letting in a slice of morning air that smelled faintly of ozone and jet fuel. The noise of the outside world filtered in. Distant engines, a forklift reversing, the muffled clang of tools from another bay. Yet inside this hangar time felt slower, contained. The ticking of the wall clock was loud enough to be heard over everything else. Ethan walked the perimeter of the jet as though memorizing it. His eyes moved with precision, every panel, every rivet, every sound. He crouched near the intake, running his fingertips lightly along the cold metal. The way a musician touches the strings before the first note. "Don't overthink it," Richard said quietly. Ethan straightened. "Machines don't lie, sir. People do." It wasn't defiance. It was conviction, wrapped in fatigue. He climbed the small access ladder, the steps creaking beneath his weight. As he leaned into the engine housing, the world narrowed to rhythm. The click of tools, the steady breath of focus, the faint tremor of a system waiting to live again. Mark hovered nearby, trying not to interfere. "You're real confident for someone without credentials," he said, half testing, half curious. Ethan adjusted a clamp and replied without looking up. "Credentials can't teach you how to listen." The moment stretched. Somewhere, a wrench slipped and hit the floor with a sharp metallic ring, the kind of sound that breaks concentration. But Ethan didn't flinch. He reconnected a sensor wire, twisted it until the contact hummed softly beneath his fingertips, then paused. "Try the power feed," he said. Mark gave Richard a questioning look. Richard's expression didn't change. "Do it." The lights on the diagnostic panel flickered to life, red across the board. The hum deepened. Ethan stepped back, his eyes locked on the readings. The first red shifted to amber. Another turned green. Then abruptly the pattern froze, one stubborn light holding the color of failure. Mark sighed, the noise heavy with vindication. "There, it's still—" "Wait," Ethan said. He moved closer again, pressing his ear to the housing. The sound that filled his head wasn't mechanical. It was language, metallic, pulsing, rhythmic. The engine wasn't broken. It was trying to tell them where it hurt. Ethan reached for the tool again. A single screw adjustment, one that seemed almost meaningless, and then slowly the sound changed. The low whine steadied, turning into a deep, smooth purr. The red light blinked once, twice, and then, like the slow exhale of something long held back, turned green. For a long moment, no one moved. Even the air seemed to pause in respect. Then the machine roared to full life, every piston, every valve sinking in harmony. Richard's coffee, untouched, had gone cold in his hand. He set it down carefully, eyes never leaving the boy. "You fixed it," he said. Ethan looked up, his face unreadable, calm, almost detached. "It was never broken. It was misunderstood." Mark stepped closer, staring at the engine, with something between pride and disbelief. "I've been working with these systems for 15 years, he murmured. "You did in 30 minutes what our entire team couldn't do in a day." Ethan removed the gloves, turning them over once, before setting them neatly on the cart. "Sometimes you stop hearing the problem because you've already decided what it should sound like." Richard smiled faintly, not the smile of triumph, but of recognition. "You sound like someone I used to know," he said quietly, almost to himself. Ethan didn't ask who. The engine continued to run, steady and strong, its sound filling the hangar with warmth that wasn't just mechanical. It was the sound of competence rediscovered, of quiet dignity reclaiming space. One of the junior technicians approached Ethan hesitantly, offering a small nod. "That was impressive," he said. Ethan only replied, "It's just an engine. Anyone can fix it if they care enough to listen." The others exchanged looks, not of mockery this time, but of thought. Pride was softening into reflection. When the system checks completed, Richard motioned for Ethan to follow him outside. The cold air hit them as the hangar doors closed behind. On the runway, the early sunlight spread like metal dust across the tarmac. "You realize what you just did, right?" Richard asked. Ethan shook his head. "Fixed a machine." "No," Richard said. "You fixed belief." Ethan looked down, unsure how to respond. For someone who had spent months being invisible, being seen again felt heavier than he'd imagined. Richard studied him. "Where did you learn to do that?" Ethan hesitated. "MIT, a long time ago, before everything went wrong." There was no self-pity in his tone, only quiet acceptance, the voice of a man who had stopped expecting sympathy and settled for truth. Richard's gaze softened. "You said yesterday that engines talk. What do they say?" Ethan's eyes drifted toward the hangar, toward the jet still humming behind them. "They tell you what they need, but only if you stop trying to prove you already know." For a long while, they stood in silence, two men separated by age and fortune, but joined by something harder to name. When Richard finally spoke, it was in a tone that carried both gratitude and decision. "Come with me to New York," he said. "I want my board to see what I saw today." Ethan turned to him, eyes cautious. "You're offering me a job." "I'm offering you a seat," Richard replied. "Let's see what you can fix next." The wind caught the edge of Richard's coat, lifting it slightly. Behind them, the engine's soft rhythm continued, a heartbeat steady and sure. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He only nodded once, his expression still calm, though a small tremor ran through his fingers. Not fear, but something older, something closer to hope, remembering how to live. As they walked back toward the hangar, the clock inside resumed its quiet ticking. This time it didn't feel like a countdown. It sounded like time beginning again. The jet climbed above the clouds in silence, leaving behind a trail that looked almost fragile against the early morning sky. Inside, the cabin lights were dimmed, the air filled with the faint hum of machinery and the distant rhythmic pulse of the engines, a sound too smooth to belong to struggle. Yet sitting opposite Richard Vaughan, Ethan Cole looked out of place, as though he had wandered into a dream that wasn't his. He sat quietly, shoulders slightly hunched, the reflection of the sky flickering in his eyes. The faint scent of burnt coffee drifted from the galley, mixing with the sterile tang of leather seats and fuel. Everything inside the jet was polished, surfaces that gleamed, silence that demanded poise. Ethan touched nothing. His hands stayed clasped together, fingers tapping a slow rhythm that echoed the ticking clock on the cabin wall. Richard watched him for a while before speaking. "You're not used to flying, are you?" Ethan shook his head. "Not like this," he said. "Most of my flights have been between shelters." There was no bitterness in his tone, only a matter-of-fact weariness. "The kind that comes from walking too far without a destination." Richard leaned back, his expression calm but thoughtful. "I've seen your kind of confidence before," he said. "The kind that comes from knowing how things work, even when no one believes you. But I've also seen what it costs." Ethan turned to him, unsure if it was a compliment or a warning. "Where did you learn to fix an engine like that?" Richard asked. Ethan hesitated, as though the answer required permission. "At MIT, he said finally. "I studied aerospace engineering. I was good at least until I wasn't." Richard waited. The pause that followed was longer than politeness required. The hum of the jet filled it like background music for a confession waiting to happen. "My father owned a small repair business," Ethan continued. "Engines, turbines, compressors, whatever paid the bills. I learned from him before I could read. When he lost everything, he tried to rebuild too fast. Took loans he couldn't handle. My mother held things together until she couldn't. She died of heart failure the year I started my thesis. After that, I just stopped showing up." His voice didn't break. It only grew quieter, thinner. "You'd be surprised how quickly people forget you exist once you stop producing results." Professors stopped replying. Friends drifted. Rent expired. And before I realized it, the world had moved on. Richard looked down, tracing a finger along the edge of the table. "You could have gone back." Ethan smiled faintly, but not from amusement. "I tried, but I didn't have the right kind of address anymore. Applications don't reach far when you list under the bridge off Lincoln Avenue as your mailing location." The truth hung between them, quiet, clean, and uncomfortable. Richard wasn't a man easily unsettled, but something in Ethan's composure, the lack of self-pity, disarmed him. It reminded him of his own younger years, before money turned every failure into a controlled risk. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed something on the table, a thin silver bracelet, engraved with 2 letters, SV, my wife's initials, he said softly. "Sarah Vaughan." She believed people should be seen even when they had nothing left to show. It's the only belief I never managed to outgrow. Ethan looked at the bracelet but didn't touch it. She sounds like someone who saw what others didn't. Richard nodded slowly. She did. Maybe that's why I keep losing people who remind me of her. The engines droned softly as the conversation faded into quiet. Outside, the horizon was painted with layers of soft gold and grey, the kind of light that made even the strongest machines seem human. Ethan leaned his head back, eyes closing briefly, not to sleep but to listen. The subtle vibration of the aircraft seemed to calm him, the way a heartbeat does when the mind finally stops fighting. Richard broke the silence. I want you to meet my board tomorrow. Show them what you did. They'll try to dismiss you, but I won't let them. Ethan opened his eyes, the faint reflection of clouds shifting across his pupils. You don't have to do that. They'll think you've lost your judgment. Richard smiled, a small measured curve of the mouth. I've lost far worse and survived. I'd rather gamble on potential than decay. There was no arrogance in his tone, only conviction. Ethan looked away, trying to find the right words, but his throat tightened. Gratitude was foreign to him. It felt heavier than debt. Why? He asked quietly. Richard paused, his gaze unfocused, as if seeing someone else in Ethan's place. Because I've built my life surrounded by experts who know everything except humility. You reminded me what it looks like. Ethan absorbed the words without reply. His jaw tightened, his hands folded again, resting over the small tear in his sleeve. Beneath the calm, something was shifting, not pride, not joy, but a faint flicker of belonging he didn't know how to hold. The jet began its descent toward New York. The light outside softened into amber, scattering across the clouds like dust. The engines hummed evenly, faithful to the boy who had listened when no one else could. Richard stood, placing the bracelet gently beside Ethan. Keep it, he said. Consider it a reminder, not of her, but of what belief can rebuild. Ethan's fingers brushed against the metal, cool, weightless, unassuming. For a moment, he saw his reflection in it, distorted by the curve. A reminder that clarity always comes bent through perspective. When the wheels touched down, the sound of landing filled the cabin, steady, precise, controlled. Ethan looked out at the vast expanse of the city below, its towers catching the first light of dawn. He didn't know what awaited him there. Another test, perhaps another fall. But for the first time in years, the horizon didn't feel like an ending. It felt like an opening. As they taxied to the private terminal, Richard glanced toward him one last time. You'll get one chance in that room, he said. They won't care where you came from, but make them care about what you can do. Ethan nodded slowly, the bracelet now resting loosely around his wrist. Engines aren't the only things that deserve a second start, he murmured. Richard smiled, though faintly, and turned toward the window. The city grew closer, and with it, the faint promise of redemption dressed in morning light. The hum of the engines softened, and for a moment, even the ticking clock seemed to pause, as if time itself had decided to listen. The next morning carried a kind of quiet clarity. The sort that comes after a storm has already made its point. The city outside the hotel window was grey and watchful, clouds hanging low over the skyline, like a lid keeping everything contained. Ethan stood by the glass, still in the same clothes he had worn the day before. The bracelet around his wrist caught a thin ray of sunlight that managed to slip between the clouds. It felt foreign there, too bright against the worn fabric of his sleeve. He had not slept much. The night had been spent thinking, not of opportunity, but of weight. He understood that a single wrong word could erase what he had just begun to build. For men like Richard Vaughan, one mistake was an inconvenience. For men like him, it was a return ticket to nowhere. The smell of burnt toast drifted faintly from the hotel kitchen below, that same tired scent that followed him everywhere, as if reminding him that perfection was a privilege only a few could afford. When the knock came at his door, it was soft but firm. Richard's assistant, a middle-aged man in a grey suit, stood there holding a garment bag and a pair of shoes that looked as though they had never known dust. Mr. Vaughan asked that you wear this for the meeting, he said. "He'll meet you downstairs in 40 minutes. Ethan thanked him quietly and closed the door. The suit inside the bag was simple. Dark navy, clean lines, tailored to fit someone slightly broader in the shoulders. He hesitated before putting it on, almost afraid it might reject him. But when he did, the mirror didn't show a stranger. It showed someone he used to be, the student who believed intelligence could be a form of faith. Downstairs, the lobby was a blend of polished stone and low conversation. Richard was seated near the entrance, a cup of black coffee untouched before him. He looked up as Ethan approached. "You clean up well," he said. Ethan offered a restrained smile. "It's the first time I've had a collar that fits in a while." Richard's reply came softer. "Don't mistake appearance for acceptance. They'll still see what they want to see." "I'm used to that," Ethan said. Outside, the car ride to Vaughan Aerospace's Manhattan office was quiet, except for the muffled rhythm of traffic and the faint hum of the electric motor. Ethan watched the skyline change, glass towers rising like vertical oceans, each window reflecting a life more certain than his. The city felt both alive and indifferent. At the corporate tower, the air inside the lobby smelled of polished wood and filtered air, artificial cleanliness meant to impress. The receptionist's voice was practiced warmth. "Good morning, Mr. Vaughan." Her eyes flicked briefly toward Ethan, assessing without cruelty, but with quiet curiosity. They rode the elevator in silence. The digital floor numbers blinked upward, one by one, accompanied by the faint tick of mechanical precision. Ethan found comfort in that sound. It reminded him of machines, of predictability, of something that could be understood. When the doors opened, a long corridor led to a glass-walled boardroom. Inside, a dozen men and women in formal suits sat around a table that gleamed like water. Their conversation stopped the moment Richard entered. "Morning, everyone," Richard said evenly. "This is Ethan Cole, the young man who fixed what none of you could." The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was cautious, analytical. Ethan could feel the shift in air, the same subtle tension that exists before a storm breaks. Tom Avery, the senior vice president, leaned back in his chair. His suit was immaculate, his smile professional but tight. "We've all heard the story," he said. "Quite the miracle. A homeless boy walks into a hangar and saves a jet worth 40 million. Sounds almost cinematic." Richard didn't rise to the bait. "It's not a story," he said. "It's proof." Tom's gaze turned to Ethan. "And what exactly are we proving today?" Ethan met his eyes, calm and unflinching. "That I can listen to a machine better than most people can read a manual." A faint murmur rippled through the room, half amusement, half intrigue. Tom smiled thinly. "Confidence is admirable, but experience matters more." Richard gestured toward the simulation console at the far end of the room. "Then let's test both." The room dimmed slightly as the screens lit up. A model of a jet engine rotated in blue light, data streaming down the sides. "Simulated compressor failure," Tom explained, settling back into his chair. "We've been trying to pinpoint the anomaly for weeks." "Let's see what you hear." Ethan approached the console, hands steady, eyes scanning the patterns. The digital hum of the system filled the silence, a low, synthetic vibration. To him, it wasn't noise. It was language. Each pulse, each irregular spike told a story. He leaned closer, brow furrowed. "Not compressor," he said softly. "Sensor echo." The vibration harmonics are out of phase. It's not a real fault. It's the software misreading feedback from the intake valve. "Adjust the threshold to 0.02. Tom raised an eyebrow, but nodded for the technician to comply. The data flickered. Red turned amber, then green. The virtual engine stabilized. The silence that followed wasn't disbelief this time. It was recognition. One of the board members whispered, "That can't be coincidence." Richard's tone was calm, almost detached. "No, it's intuition." Tom sat back, arms folded, his expression unreadable. He was too seasoned to show defeat, but his jaw tightened just enough to betray discomfort. "Impressive," he said after a moment. "Though intuition is a dangerous thing in engineering." Ethan looked at him quietly. "So is pride." Richard's mouth twitched just slightly. The meeting ended with polite applause that wasn't really about celebration. It was acknowledgement, reluctant but genuine. As they exited, Richard placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. You handled that better than I expected. Ethan shook his head. They don't trust me. They don't have to, Richard said. They just have to respect you. Trust comes later, sometimes much later. Outside, the wind had picked up. The air smelled faintly of rain and city smoke. Ethan loosened his tie, the gesture more symbolic than necessary. Does this ever get easier? He asked. Richard gave a small smile. No, but you get stronger. They walked toward the waiting car, footsteps echoing against the marble floor. Ethan glanced once more at the tower, the glass reflecting the clouds above, half light, half shadow. In that reflection, he didn't see the homeless boy anymore. He saw a man standing between two worlds, one built of steel and precision, the other of faith and memory. As the car door closed, he thought of his father's voice, of nights spent fixing rusted turbines in a garage that smelled of oil and burnt bread. He wondered what his father would say now, seeing him surrounded by people who measured worth in silence rather than effort. The city blurred past the window as they drove away. Somewhere beneath the noise of engines and horns, Ethan thought he heard it again, that faint hum of balance, of things aligning, not perfection, but purpose. Rain swept across the city that evening in thin diagonal lines, tracing light over glass and concrete. From the upper floors of Vaughan Aerospace, the skyline looked blurred, like a watercolor bleeding at the edges. The sound of distant thunder pulsed softly against the windows, and in the dim glow of the office, Ethan stood alone beside a digital schematic. The display projected a quiet rhythm of blue light onto his face, calm, analytical, almost detached. Behind him, the faint hiss of an espresso machine filled the break room. The smell of burnt toast lingered from someone's late meal, sharp and comforting in its own way. It reminded Ethan of long nights at MIT, when hunger was easier to ignore than the sound of failure. He closed the display, rubbing the bridge of his nose. It was past midnight. The door opened. Tom Avery stepped inside, his reflection splitting across the glass wall. Tall, composed, the kind of man who carried his reputation like a well-tailored coat. "You're still here," he said. Ethan didn't turn. "So are you," Tom smiled faintly. "Someone has to make sure the new prodigy doesn't break what we've spent decades building." There was no malice in his tone, only precision, the measured sharpness of a man defending his place. Ethan could sense it, the quiet resentment disguised as professionalism. "You don't need to worry," he said. "I'm just finishing up diagnostics." "I read the reports," Tom said, pacing slowly. "Richard's quite taken with you. He thinks you're some kind of visionary." He paused, eyes scanning the blueprint. "But vision without structure is chaos. We've seen that before." Ethan finally looked at him. "Structure without humility isn't any better." The room fell into a brief silence. The rain outside softened into a rhythmic tapping that matched the ticking of the wall clock, an accidental harmony that made the tension between them feel almost civil. Tom adjusted his cufflinks, the faint glint of gold catching the light. "You're talented," he said, "but talent can't replace experience. This company isn't built on inspiration. It's built on consistency." Ethan considered his words carefully. Maybe that's the problem. You can't build the future by fearing what's new. For the first time, Tom's voice hardened. And you can't protect a legacy by dismantling it overnight. It wasn't anger. It was fear speaking in the language of authority. Tom's career had been built in straight lines, rules, reports, approval chains. Ethan represented everything unpredictable, everything that couldn't be managed with a memo. Richard's sudden faith in the boy had tilted the balance. And Tom, like any man who'd worked too long for control, felt the shift beneath his feet. After a long silence, Tom stepped closer. "You'll learn soon enough," he said quietly. "The higher you rise here, the thinner the air gets." Then he left, the door closing with a muted click that lingered longer than it should have. Ethan exhaled slowly and turned back to the screen. His reflection stared back at him, calm, composed, but not untouched. He wasn't angry. He understood. Fear made people territorial. Pride made them blind. Both were things he had known intimately in himself once. He began gathering his notes when the door opened again. This time, it was Richard. The older man's presence carried a kind of steady gravity. His expression unreadable, his coat damp from the rain. I heard Tom stop by, Richard said. Ethan nodded. He's not wrong. He just doesn't trust what he doesn't understand. Richard's gaze lingered. You handled yourself? Yes. Good, Richard said softly. He took a step closer, looking at the schematic. You see this engine differently from the rest of us. It's not about control for you, is it? Ethan shook his head. Machines don't want control. They want balance, Richard smiled faintly. Balance, he repeated. Something we all seem to be chasing. They stood in silence for a moment, both men listening to the distant rumble of thunder. The air in the room felt charged, but not from the storm, from something heavier, quieter. You've made progress here, Richard said, but progress invites envy. Don't mistake quiet rooms for peace. I know, Ethan said. Envy's just fear with a better wardrobe. Richard gave a quiet laugh, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, but carries truth. I'll remember that. He placed a folder on the table. We're moving ahead with the hybrid prototype you suggested. I want you to oversee the diagnostics next week. Ethan blinked. That's a big step, Richard's tone softened. You earned it. But be careful, Ethan. Not everyone in this building wants you to succeed. Tom's pride may sound like caution, but pride has a way of growing roots. Ethan nodded, though his eyes drifted toward the window. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the city below glimmering in faint reflections. I'll be careful, he said. When Richard left, the room felt larger, emptier. Ethan gathered his things, the bracelet on his wrist catching the soft light again. He paused to look at it, thumb brushing the engraving. SV. The initials had begun to mean more than a person. They had become a quiet reminder of responsibility. As he walked out, the night air greeted him with its cool, metallic scent. The streets were slick with rain, lights shimmering in the puddles like restless stars. A cab passed, leaving a faint trail of exhaust that smelled faintly of heat and carbon. He watched it fade, then continued down the street alone. Somewhere above him, lightning flashed, brief, silent, but precise. And in that flash, Ethan thought of what Richard had said. Balance. It wasn't something given. It was something built, piece by piece, word by word, until the noise of the world finally made sense again. He knew the days ahead would not be kind. Tom's doubt would not vanish, and the higher he climbed, the more invisible his footing would become. But for now, there was a strange peace in knowing that even in a room full of pride, humility could still be heard, quiet, steady, and sure. The air in the lab was still, as if the machines themselves were holding their breath. Rows of idle equipment hummed faintly, a mechanical heartbeat in a room that had once been full of motion. The smell of burnt solder lingered from the previous night's testing, sharp, metallic, faintly sweet. Ethan sat alone at a workstation. A pile of circuit boards spread before him like pieces of a broken puzzle. His reflection in the monitor looked tired but composed, eyes shadowed by sleepless nights and quiet worry. It had been 3 days since the board approved the prototype project. 3 days since the congratulatory handshakes faded into the quiet friction of envy. Tom Avery's voice still echoed through the corridors, calm, persuasive, poisonous in tone. Innovation is fragile, he had said in a meeting. One untested idea can bring down an entire system. His words weren't aimed at Ethan directly, but the glance that followed had been sharp enough to leave a mark. Ethan had learned early that distrust rarely announced itself loudly. It moved quietly, through whispers, misplaced reports, a missing file here, a late authorization there. By the end of the week, his access to several systems had been temporarily restricted for review. No one told him why. Now, under the sterile light, he sat trying to piece together what had gone wrong. The silence of the lab pressed against his thoughts. It was broken only by the ticking of the small clock on the wall, steady and indifferent. When the door finally opened, he didn't look up. The footsteps were too familiar. Working late again? Tom's voice carried a practiced politeness, the kind that hides the satisfaction of control. Ethan replied without turning. Some of us have work that isn't finished. Tom approached slowly, hands in his pockets. I admire that, though it's a shame your clearance doesn't reflect the same commitment. Ethan's hands paused mid-motion. You did this? Tom smiled faintly. I followed protocol. You've been accessing restricted design schematics outside your department. The compliance team raised concerns. Ethan turned then, his face calm, but his voice stripped of any disguise. Those files were for the diagnostics you approved. Tom shrugged lightly. Then it's just a misunderstanding. But until it's cleared, you're suspended from active projects. There was no triumph in his tone, only a cool finality. For Tom, this wasn't cruelty. It was preservation. He had seen too many bright minds rise too fast and burn the structure that supported them. To him, Ethan was a risk disguised as genius. Ethan didn't argue. He simply nodded once, removed his ID badge and placed it on the table. "Machines don't lie," he said quietly. "People do." Tom's jaw tightened, though only for a moment. "Careful with those kinds of statements," he said. "They sound like arrogance when spoken too softly." When he left, the room felt smaller. The rain outside had turned steady, tapping softly against the tall windows. Ethan stared at the faint reflection of the city lights on the wet glass. For the first time in years, he felt something close to the familiar ache of failure. It didn't feel heavy, just precise like a memory, replaying itself to remind him where he had started. He gathered his tools into a small bag and left the building without speaking to anyone. The guard at the entrance nodded as he passed. Ethan nodded back, a quiet exchange between two men who understood what it meant to endure without explanation. Outside, the night air smelled of wet asphalt and faint diesel, the kind of scent that always carried stories of distance. He walked without direction until the lights thinned and the noise of the city softened into a low hum. He found himself in a part of the industrial district he used to visit when scavenging for discarded parts. Old warehouses lined the street like forgotten monuments, their windows dark, their doors rusted shut. He entered one he knew, an abandoned repair hangar, its floor littered with dust and fragments of metal. The silence there was different. It wasn't sterile like the lab. It was honest. He set down his bag, took off his coat and began working. The old workbench creaked as he laid out his components. The air was cold enough for breath to fog slightly, and the smell of rust mingled with faint oil residue. Every sound, the click of a screwdriver, the scrape of metal, echoed clearly. He wasn't sure when the idea came. Perhaps it had been forming quietly, beneath the noise of meetings and protocols. A system that could listen to machines the way he could, not through data but through resonance, through tone and vibration. An artificial intelligence trained not on numbers, but on sound. He scribbled the first lines of the design on a torn envelope. Project Aurora. The name felt right, something about light emerging after darkness. He began assembling parts from what he had collected over the years: an old microcontroller, a broken acoustic sensor, a second-hand amplifier. The tools were crude, but the precision came from his hands, not the equipment. Hours passed unnoticed. The first flicker of dawn seeped through the broken windows, turning dust into a slow, golden haze. The small device on the table blinked once, then stabilized with a faint hum, a tone so subtle it could have been mistaken for silence. Ethan smiled faintly, a rare expression that softened the usual stillness of his face. He pressed his hand lightly against the surface. The vibration beneath it felt alive. "Listen," he whispered, not to the machine, but to himself. Outside, the city was waking. The sound of traffic, the rumble of delivery trucks, the far-off wail of a siren, they all seemed to merge with the soft tone of Aurora. For the first time in days, Ethan felt aligned again, not successful, not redeemed, just aligned. He sat back, the bracelet glinting in the dim light, and allowed himself one deep breath. There was still a long road ahead, the misunderstanding to clear, the truth to prove, but for now there was this. The beginning of something built not to impress, but to endure. The morning began with the faint scent of rain still clinging to the air, that peculiar mix of wet concrete, oil, and quiet renewal. The city outside was waking, slow and deliberate, its rhythm muted by a low fog that rolled between the towers. Inside Vaughan Aerospace, the corridors were already alive with motion, muted conversations, the shuffle of polished shoes, the hum of elevators carrying people with schedules tighter than conscience. In Richard Vaughan's office, the light was dimmed to a soft amber, the kind he favored when he wanted to think. He stood by the window, coffee in hand, unread reports stacked neatly on his desk. His reflection in the glass looked older than he felt, but steadier, a man who had learned to survive both failure and success, though neither had made him happy for long. The door opened without announcement. Harper Lewis entered, his movements slower than they used to be, but deliberate, grounded. He wore his old NASA windbreaker, faded at the collar, a relic of decades spent in the pursuit of propulsion and silence. "You asked for me," he said. Richard nodded. "Yes, I wanted to show you something." He tapped the control on his desk, and the screen behind him came to life. Lines of code, vibration graphs, acoustic spectrograms. At the center, the words Project Aurora blinked softly, rhythmic, like a living pulse. Harper stepped closer, frowning. "Ethan's work," Richard nodded again. "They suspended him last week, I heard," Harper said quietly. "Tom's doing." Richard turned, meeting his gaze. "You still believe in him?" Harper's reply came without hesitation. "Belief isn't the right word. I recognize what he is, the kind of mind that sees systems where others see noise. That's not belief. That's physics." Richard's lips curved slightly. "Good. Then you'll help me prove he's right." By mid-morning, word spread quietly through the company. The prototype Ethan had designed, the one dismissed as unauthorized, was being tested in the main diagnostics bay. Engineers gathered along the observation windows, whispering, speculating. Tom Avery stood among them, hands folded neatly behind his back, the image of composure. But beneath that surface calm was unease, the kind that comes when control begins to slip unnoticed. In the hangar below, Ethan stood beside the test rig, wearing the same worn jacket he had brought from the warehouse. His face carried the calm of exhaustion, the steadiness of someone who had already been broken once and decided not to break again. Beside him, Dr. Harper adjusted a calibration panel. "You're sure this will work?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "If the engine speaks, Aurora will hear it." The lights dimmed. The turbine began to spin, first slow, then faster, until the air filled with the low hum of potential energy. On the screen, waves of sound translated into light. Blue, shifting to yellow, yellow to red. Every fluctuation mapped in real time. The data didn't just measure, it interpreted. Tom leaned toward the glass, his voice low. "What exactly am I supposed to be impressed by? A sound graph?" Richard didn't look at him. "Wait." A sudden vibration flickered across the screen, the kind that would normally go unnoticed, buried in background noise. But Aurora detected it instantly, isolating the frequency, tracing it back to a single valve imbalance that could have led to catastrophic failure. Ethan adjusted one setting. The red line leveled out. Silence. Then, in a moment that felt too quiet to be ordinary, the system stabilized completely. Harper exhaled softly. "It's listening," Richard smiled faintly. "No, it's understanding." The boardroom behind the glass was utterly still. Even Tom's voice faltered for a moment before he found it again. "It's impressive, I'll admit. But we can't verify data built on unsanctioned architecture. There are protocols." "Protocols," Richard interrupted calmly, "are for maintaining what already works. We're building what comes next." For once, Tom didn't reply. His expression was unreadable, not defeat, but a kind of reluctant respect. The kind that comes when the truth no longer needs argument. When the test concluded, applause broke out among the engineers, hesitant at first, then growing. Ethan didn't look up. His hands rested on the console, eyes still fixed on the pattern of lights, fading from red to green. He wasn't smiling. He was listening to the balance he had always chased, finally finding its tone. Richard approached him quietly. "You built this from nothing," he said. Ethan shook his head. "Not nothing. From what people threw away." Harper placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice low. "That's where most good things begin." Later that evening, after the reports were signed, and the tension eased into relief, Richard met Ethan in the hangar again. The air smelled faintly of grease and ozone, the kind of scent that clings to progress. Outside, the rain had stopped. "I want you to lead Aurora," Richard said. "Not as a technician. As its architect." Ethan hesitated. "I don't belong in boardrooms." "Neither did I once," Richard replied. He reached into his coat and handed Ethan a small envelope. Inside was a check and a handwritten note for the Sarah Vaughan Foundation. "Let's teach others to listen too." Ethan looked at it for a long moment, the faint tremor of emotion passing through his hands. "You mean, train them?" Richard nodded. "The forgotten ones. The ones like you. Let's give them permission to fix what the world ignores." The hum of the lights filled the space between them. It was a simple sound, but steady, the sound of something that worked because it was finally seen. Ethan glanced toward the jet in the corner, the same one where it had all begun. He remembered the burnt toast smell of that first hangar, the weight of the gloves in his hands, the quiet permission that had changed everything. He turned back to Richard, voice steady. "Then let's start where it all broke, and build from there." Outside, dawn was breaking again. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the clouds, catching the surface of the aircraft until it glowed. For a brief second, the light reflected across Ethan's face, soft and golden, like something reborn. He looked at the bracelet on his wrist, the letters SV shining faintly in the morning glow, and smiled, not in triumph but in peace. The years that followed passed like steady rain, not sudden or loud, but constant enough to reshape everything it touched. Vaughan Aerospace grew into something quieter, more purposeful. The company's walls no longer echoed, only with the sound of machines, but with the hum of classrooms, training labs, and soft human voices, young men and women learning how to listen to engines the way Ethan once had, through patience rather than pride. At the far end of the main facility, a modest glass building bore a small plaque, the Sarah Vaughan Foundation for Innovation and Renewal. Every morning, light spilled through its transparent walls and onto the workshop floors, where students worked in groups, some fresh from university, others from the streets or shelters they were trying to leave behind. The smell of solder and hot metal filled the air. Familiar and grounding, Ethan often stood at the doorway, not as a supervisor, but as a quiet observer. His hair had grown slightly longer, his posture more composed, though his hands still carried the small scars of years spent holding tools instead of pens. The bracelet remained on his wrist, worn smooth by time. Richard's photograph hung on the far wall, smiling in that subtle, reserved way he had, the kind of smile that belonged to a man who had learned to let go. He had passed away the previous winter, peacefully in his sleep. The company had held a memorial service that drew thousands, but Ethan hadn't spoken. He couldn't. Words felt insufficient for a man who had once given him permission to rebuild his life. Now, as Ethan walked between the workbenches, the sound of machines layered with quiet laughter and the soft clicking of wrenches. He felt the same warmth he used to feel in the hum of an engine, steady, alive, whole. One of the apprentices, a boy no older than 20, looked up from his workstation. "Mr. Cole," he said shyly, "how do you know when a machine's really fixed?" Ethan smiled faintly. "When it stops asking for help," he said. The boy nodded, not fully understanding but filing it away, as students do when they sense truth, even without clarity. Later that day, Ethan visited Harper's old office. The desk was clean, save for a framed note that had arrived in the mail years before, written in Harper's neat, deliberate handwriting. "You didn't just fix engines, son. You fixed how the world listens." Ethan read it again, the paper softened by age. The room smelled faintly of paper, metal, and the distant hint of burnt coffee, the scent of memory itself. Outside, evening settled over the campus. The last of the sunlight stretched across the foundation's glass facade, turning it into a mirror that reflected the faces of the students working inside, faces full of quiet determination, not unlike his own years ago. Ethan stood for a long moment, his reflection merging with theirs. The ticking clock on the wall marked the hour, its rhythm blending with the faint mechanical hum below. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The work, the people, the hum, they were all speaking now, louder than words ever could. As he turned to leave, a soft voice from behind called out, "The same boy from earlier." "Sir," he said, holding up a tool. "If you permit, I'll fix it." Ethan paused, then smiled, calm, proud, and quietly fulfilled. The sound of the boy's voice echoed faintly through the hall, finding its place among the machines, the memories. and the legacy of those who had once dared to listen.